Hi guys, and welcome back. Today is going to be part one of a two-part series where I talk about fantasy skin colors and how I like to think about them and create them. But today we are focusing on how to do a blue-skinned character. I love creating characters that have skin colors that are not naturally occurring. I find that it opens up a lot more options as far as color palettes. It's a lot more creative and fun for me to work with, and it does allow you to be able to work in ways of showing more ambient lighting that can affect the overall situation of a piece, and it breaks you away from thinking only of objects in its local color. So my first tip for working with fantasy skin colors is to work with analogous color schemes. I find that I get the best results when I start off with those as the root of the colors that I'm choosing. So analogous color schemes, if you don't know what that is basically about three colors that are immediately next to each other on the color wheel. So say blue, blue-green, and green, that would be an analogous color scheme. I find that this is really helpful because it helps me to create cooler areas on the skin as well as warmer areas. I can assign a certain color or temperature, that is, to the shadows and different ones to the highlights. So this all just comes together to help me to be able to think of the basic colors that will build up the skin tone. Now, I don't force myself to only rely on those colors. If I want to incorporate different ones, say something that's much warmer for the blush or something that's a lot cooler for the shadow, I don't restrict myself, but it does really help me to not get overwhelmed by trying to add too many different colors too quickly. And tip number two, I kind of touched on a little bit, but it's always really good to remember the rule of light. So what that is when you have a cool light source, you tend to have a warmer shadow. And when you have a warm light source, you tend to have a cool shadow. And this is actually really cool because you can clearly see it in real life, day to day. If you happen to live somewhere where it snows, if you see the shadows that are cast on snow when you have a really warm light, like say the sun's out, it looks very blue and you can clearly see that. And the same works in reverse. If you have a very cool blue light, the shadows tend to look really warm, almost orange. And it's a really cool trick where you can choose a color palette so that it really pushes that. If you want it to feel like a really warm and inviting area, you can use warm colors for the highlights on the skin. So for this one, in example, I tried to focus most of the deep shadows as more of a purple color. So I tried to push that as more of the cool tones. And I did incorporate a little bit more of a blue-green, a little bit more of a warmer green, that is, into some of the shadows to add a little bit more variety, but the deepest, darkest shadows, those are still reserved for the purples. And my next tip is an extension beyond just working with analogous colors as your root, and that's moving on and not being afraid of adding contrasting colors to add more interest and also to bring contrast to certain areas and different features. So I love being able to add in blush or show where the blood is coming to the surface of the skin. So like fingertips, kneecaps, and the tip of the nose sometimes, blush, the edges of ears. There are a lot of different areas where you can add that kind of a detail. And you don't have to always go warmer, but naturally it might look better that way. I love being able to go in and add a hint of red in a lot of different skin colors. I actually think that it looks really good, even with this blue. Well, it looks really good with the blue because it does turn into almost this bright, beautiful purple. So it turns a lot more interest to it, but because I used it more sparingly, particularly in this one, it gravitates the eyes to the eyes in the painting. It helps reinforce that that's the focus by really keeping it pared down to very special areas. I kept it on the eyes and on her shoulders and a tiny bit on her collarbones, but as far as her face, I actually kept it pretty minimal. I didn't go with a lot of blush. I just wanted it focused on her eyes. And I do have a few tips for watercolors. They're pretty general for a lot of different things, but I find them to be extra important when it comes to skin when you want it to have really smooth gradients. But I always use a heat gun, and you can see me pulling that out every once in a while. That's the green tool that I use. And I'll link to what I actually use down in the description. But I highly recommend either using that or taking out your hair blow dryer if you have one and drying out your paints. I find that sometimes when I let really nicely blended out gradients sit and air dry naturally, they can sometimes break apart and leave edges where there weren't edges, or where it looked like it was a perfect gradient, they actually start breaking down. So I would really suggest drying it out quickly once you get it the way that you want it to. I've been a lot happier when I've reacted quickly and been able to preserve that Even specifically on this one, there have been a few places where I thought that I had blended out into perfectly clear water, but then as it dried, it created a little bit of this edge along where the water was, where the wet stopped and the dry was. You could see this line in her skin, but I found that when I reacted quickly and I let that dry with my heat gun, when I forced it to dry quickly, I didn't get that nearly as often. And another tool that I like to use to create really smooth, faded out gradients is actually use a wet paper towel. I will dip it in my paint, or in my water that is, and wring it out so it's not sopping wet, but it's still wet. And then when I create a gradient where most of the paint and the pigment is up at the top, and then I fade it out with just water, I'll go in with that paper towel and blot at the edge of that. That helps break it up so that it's not this uniform straight line, or whatever the shape ended up being, but it does feather that out so that I can have a softer edge even still beyond that I'm creating with my brush. And another tip is if you're struggling with getting the highlights and the shadow planes and basically the values correct on the skin, a great way to get it correct if you're having a hard time converting from a natural skin color into a fantasy skin color is to actually take your reference photo and just turn it into black and white in Photoshop or whatever editing software you use, and then instantly you can see where the values are. It actually is really interesting because the eye and the brain perceives some colors as being lighter than they actually are and some colors as being darker than they actually are. Like yellow is often seen as lighter, but when you compare it with the actual value, a lot of times it's darker than we think it will be. So that trick really helps being able to see what values are happening, where you need to be putting them. I've gotten a lot better results once I started doing that, and I could clearly see where they're placed. And it gives me, again, the control of where I want to create more cool shadows. I can really push that. I don't have to be tied into what I'm seeing in the photo or letting the photo manipulate how I'm planning out the colors on my actual piece. This allows me to purely see value and make sure that that value is represented on the painting, but beyond that, the colors are all my own imagination. And another thing that I love to do to skin and pretty much all shapes is to create one final sealing layer over the whole thing, and that just brings it all together. And for this one, I still wanted to preserve some of the variations in the color itself, so I did have some colors pre-mixed before I started creating this final glazing. And that was the main color that I had, which is a pretty solid true blue, and then I had more of a cool purple and then a blue-green, and that way I could focus them where most of the color was underneath, and that helped it so that it didn't become too blended out. I find that sometimes if you go over it with one color over the whole shape, that it can really knock down some of the variation that you have. But when you let these colors blend very naturally together, it creates this beautiful harmonizing effect where it still preserves the color underneath, but then it also helps push that blend a lot more than it was when it was just the colors beneath. And I think my final tip is don't be afraid to try something out, something new and different. I found that almost all of my watercolors will clean up very cleanly. So what I do is I keep a wet paper towel, again, wringed out, but I keep that next to me at all times. So if I put something down, say it's a glaze of a color that I wasn't sure I would like, if I don't like it, I can very quickly dab up that paint layer that I did, or that blush color that maybe I don't like anymore, or the shadow that wasn't the right value or wasn't the right color. I can clean that up quickly, and being prepared for that has allowed me to be a lot more courageous with choices, where instead of being very timid with building things up, I can put them down, and if they don't work, I can take them off. But again, this comes very much from understanding your pigments that you're using and your paints, and to know which ones will stain and which ones will lift off cleanly. Again, I found that only, I think maybe 2 of my own paints are more staining, but pretty much everything else will lift off very easily. So get comfortable with your own paints and how they behave. That way you know how you can utilize them best when you're creating these kind of skin colors. And that is it for today. If you'd like to own the original painting from today, I do have a link down in the description that'll take you to my art shop. I do also have prints of her available as well, and I do have a link to my Patreon down there, and that's a great way to get behind the scenes content and exclusive content, especially for my patrons. But that is about it for today, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time, which will be next Wednesday. So I'll see you then.